and we're going to introduce Mr. Appel. Mr. Appel comes from UC San Diego Extension, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. He can do it more succinctly. We are so fortunate to have him. And you're up.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody. I think this is the most number of people I've ever had in my home. So welcome to my home, and thank you for all coming. I'm very glad to have you here. This is a somewhat unconventional way of delivery. I do hope that I am camera ready. I got one of those at-home haircuts my wife gave me. She has pleaded with me not to show you the back of my head, so I do promise to do that. My name is Morgan Appel, and I am the Assistant Dean of Education and Community Outreach at UC San Diego Extension. And Education and Community Outreach serves about 75,000 students and individuals per year across the globe. We focus on pre-college programming, so K-12 programming, programming for teachers and community, and also programming for 50 plus. One of the features that we also have through our department is the UCTV STEAM channel. So we know that many of you are looking at ways to engage kids at home and to keep them busy and to provide a sense of structure and engagement. And I would encourage you, if you do get the chance, head on over to UCTV, the STEAM channel. So you can go to ucsd.tv and you will be right there. So at any rate, today we're going to be talking about resilience at a distance, social emotional support for the gifted and talented in the age of remote learning. And we've all sort of had to make this sudden shift, but within the dark cloud, there really is a silver lining, and there's a lot of work that we can do to support our gifted and talented. So before we begin, I just want to remind you, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. We will endeavor to answer as many of them as we can today, but if not, I promise that I will email you answers to anything that you have moving forward. You know where I live, you know where to find me, so you know that I will keep my word. Now, this presentation, as well as related resources and materials. So I've also created a list of resources for you, some materials around socio-emotional characteristics of giftedness. You just have to go to my SlideShare account. If you go to https://www.slideshare.net, search my name, and you will find these materials. There's also a Morgan Appel that does French cooking. Not one and the same, but if you do like the recipes, I am happy to take the credit for them. I would like to begin just by making sure we understand the context of who we are dealing with. And of course, much of what you see will have been magnified or amplified given current conditions, but let's just set our bearings, set a foundation. So when we talk about giftedness, we look at being gifted as a gift, and usually when kids are identified gifted, the parents go, "Oh, great," and the kids go, "Oh, great." So unless you're the one experiencing firsthand, it may not really feel like a gift. It can be both a blessing and a burden, and we find that a number of our gifted and talented individuals put on an emotional suit of armor because it is important for them to appear outwardly as though everything is okay. And we'll talk about that more when we get to perfectionism and imposter syndrome. Related to this is a tendency to look outwardly for approval and inwardly for blame. Also experiencing performance pressures. And it's not always coming from the outside, although they may interpret in an exaggerated way that they do. But they feel that the spotlight is always upon them, even when they're by themselves. They have standards with which they have to live up. When working with gifted and talented individuals, we find that any solutions to issues have to be epiphany-based. And what I mean by epiphany-based, it has to come from them. If you provide advice, no matter how sage, no matter how friendly, it can be perceived as a threat against their social personality. So you'll get feedback because they're thinking, well, what am I doing wrong? So if you imagine you're focusing inwardly for blame, that would be something you would see. And for our gifted and talented, they'll always rise to the academic occasion. The greatest risk we see is the social risk. And the greatest challenge we find, not only for educators, but also for parents, tends to be social emotional. And we know for our gifted and talented, things tend to come naturally without having to work hard in most cases. So they come up with the answer without really having to go through process. They are able to make quick calculations, almost like Russell Crowe did in A Beautiful Mind. It just appears to them. So the first time that they do actually have to put effort into it, they may look at themselves and go, wait, what's wrong? I've never had to work like this before. Something must be wrong. Now, also important to know is that left to their own devices, these characteristics do not disappear. In fact, we talk about gifted students in the school context, but really we're talking about gifted and talented individuals. And we find that these characteristics may actually become magnified throughout the lifespan, most pronounced during adolescence. So it's important that we attend to them with fidelity early on. Now, we're going to cover a few topics in this presentation. We're going to look at the relationship between emotion and learning. We're going to look at socio-emotional characteristics of giftedness and talent, including perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And we're going to take a look at remote learning and how that might impact the social-emotional condition of our gifted and talented. But we always knew that there was a relationship between emotion and learning. Not just since the advent of medical science and modern neurobiology, but even in ancient Egypt. So when humans were first preserved through mummification, they often discarded the brain as a superfluous organ because they believed that the heart was the center of all emotional learning. So in a very straightforward way, they were able to make the connection. Hence, rule number one. Peace of mind before everything else. And I think our challenges with remote learning speak to this powerfully. We always want to attend to the social emotional first and foremost. Everything else follows in its wake. We need to be able to provide clarity. Ambiguity begets anxiety. So when things are ambiguous, it triggers a neurobiological survival response. So it's important that there is peace of mind and opportunities for success, no matter how small, because even we know that when you become competent at something, you gain a sense of confidence. And from confidence, you're willing to try something else and move a bit forward. So one of the things that we know through tried and true practice throughout the ages, that neuroscience dictates no matter what kind of instructional sorcery you can advance, learners will not move forward if they remain in survival mode. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Let's look at the neurochemistry of experience. When we have a positive experience about learning, this produces a number of neurochemicals, including endorphins, which produces a sense of euphoria, and dopamine, which stimulates the prefrontal cortex. This is the neurochemistry of persistence. When you find success at something and the endorphins and dopamine are released, it means you want to go back and get that feeling again. So when you have positive experiences about learning, you're going to want to pursue more learning. The converse is also true. Negative feelings about learning produces a chemical called norepinephrine, noradrenaline, and cortisol, which place the brain into survival mode and cause anxiety. So the idea that we are filled with adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol causes us to focus on an immediate problem ahead, and adrenaline provides the neurochemistry to do so. So when we think about people who say that they don't like routine, that may be a little bit of an overstatement. People tend to like routine because it provides a sense of stability and a sense of consistency. And what you'll find about the neurochemistry of experience, when we talk about learning experience, you will also find that positive and negative feedback work in the same way. And we know that feedback also presents a unique challenge to working with gifted and talented. So let's take a look at stress. I think we've all been a little bit stressed lately. Some of us through nonstop Zoom meetings, a lot of us are, not leaving the house as much as we have. We miss certain things. So let's take a look at what stress does. So we all know that a little bit of stress actually is a good thing. We're talking about brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations, and stress hormones. These are the things that sort of get us going. We know that every learning experience triggers the survival mechanism and triggers the stress response. Tolerable levels of stress are serious but temporary stress responses buffered by supportive relationships. And we know that your students have those. So if they're experiencing stress, they have you, they have their extended family, they have their teachers to rely upon. But when we talk about toxic stress, we're talking about prolonged activation of response systems without protective relationships. And what we know that sort of thing tends to alter the microarchitecture of the brain, and then moves to serve as catalyst for underachievement and avoidance behaviors. Because one of the things that we know about the neurochemistry of avoidance, that negative experience we talked about, is if you feel badly, if you feel stressed, if you are suffering from the physical symptoms of stress, you're going to want to avoid situations where that occurs. So it's important that we understand stress, because in gifted and talented, what we know about them, there is really one word that sums up sort of all of the socio-emotional characteristics, and that word is intensity. Now, when I was studying intensity, I wanted to Google image search the picture that really most captured intensity, and I think this is perhaps the best one. As you can see, this is a girl who intensely loves her ice cream. So what we know is that giftedness has both intellectual and emotional elements, and they are complex, multi-layered, multifaceted, and interwoven. And for the gifted and talented individual, intensity impacts every aspect of their lives. And what we're talking about is going all out in just about everything, pedal to the metal. It's not that they feel more than those who are not identified gifted or non-gifted, but they feel they experience the feelings rather vividly and deeply. It's almost like living in Pixar, where everything is bright and vibrant. So what we want to make sure is that we attend to these, because sometimes these experiences can prove alarming, which warrants our attention. So what does intensity look and feel like? You may see emotional extremes that change frequently. So happy 1 minute, upset the next. You may just turn around to put some dishes away and everything was fine. You turn back around and it's bedlam, and it happens that fast. We know that there are physical body mirrors, things like headaches, nausea, and rapid heartbeat. We see inhibition, timidity, and shyness, sometimes a feeling of being out of control. sometimes depressive moods, feelings of inadequacy or inferiority, and obsessive attachments, which is something we'll get into in just a bit. So that's what intensity looks and feels like. Let's talk about some general socio-emotional traits that we see in gifted and talented individuals. Mind you, this is not a laundry list. So it's not as though you check all of these out and say, okay, yep, she's gifted. What this means is that in the review of the research and the review of practice, this is what we found generally. And so divergent thinking, sometimes people talk about, oh, here's somebody who thinks out of the box. This is really thinking without a box. You'll see things like excitability and hypersensitivity, a real degree of perceptiveness, and entelechy, which is a motivation to forge one's own destiny. So you might see your child watching a medical drama, and they decide right there and then that they want to be a doctor, and they're going to do absolutely everything to do it. So they are going to get all A's in science classes, go to pre-med and ace that. They may not even like people, they may not like blood, but they decided early on that's where they want to go, and that's where they will go. You will see that the ongoing development of the brain during childhood surfaces a variety of social and emotional issues, those which we will talk about. And these are noticeable, prevalent in gifted and talented individuals, and they become
Mr. Appel,
magnified.
may I interrupt you for just one moment?
Mm-hmm.
We think we have figured out the translation situation. So Mr. Lang is just going to say a few things.
Okay, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've been in the background trying to fix the issue. For all of our translators, you should be able to select your language at the bottom and speak as Mr. Appel is speaking. Anybody at home who needs translation, you could pick at the bottom Korean, Spanish, or if you need Armenian, pick the Russian. Trust me, it's going to be Armenian, and that should be working. Just let us know in the chat if there's any issues. But we just need to let all the interpreters know that they can start live interpreting Mr. Appel's words. Okay, that's it.
Okay. So moving on. So one of the things that if you are parents of adolescents or soon to be adolescents, you should know that what we're going to talk about actually becomes most magnified during adolescence. So you've got something to look forward to. A lot of what we see comes out of asynchrony. And really what asynchrony, so if you think of what it means to be in sync, if you think about human development, for every year you grow physically, you should grow 1 year cognitively and 1 year social emotionally. And when we talk about asynchrony, we're talking about that the chronological age, social, emotional, and physical and intellectual development are out of sync with one another. So you may have a student who is gifted and talented, who's advanced. In 1 year, they've grown 1 year physically, they've grown 4 years cognitively, but they may have even regressed a year social emotionally. So you will find that the intensity having to do with that, that growth is impacted by asynchrony. You'll also find that that your kids may have difficulty finding friends with similar interests, ability, and drive. Sometimes they may appear frustrated over a perceived lack of challenge. And sometimes there's also a question of fit within the larger school society. Now, when I went to school, you know, there were fairly established cliques within, but I think what you're finding is that you have even more of a question moving forward. We've talked about emotional intensity and deep emotional reactions, and this really goes to say that there are no sort of throwaway comments, no innocuous comments. So, you know, as an educator, for example, you see two kids who are talking to one another, and they might say, oh, isn't this a great class? And, you know, oh, I really like it, and I'm really into what he's teaching. And you know, I might turn around as a teacher and say, well, you know, excuse me, the rest of the class can't hear. Would you mind keeping it down. And what you'll find is that that is not interpreted in the same way. So you may have one of the students look at the other and go, why did he just yell at us? We were just saying nice things about us. You know, what is the matter with him? He must not like me. So what you're putting out there, for example, may not be what is being interpreted. You will also find that these are kids with well-developed senses of justice and fairness, but these tend to be highly idealized, which makes it harder for them, for example, to see shades of gray. This idea, if you do the crime, you do the time. But you know, they will call you on it if they think something is unfair. Having a really strong sense of empathy with both children and adults, an interest in advanced subject matter or materials, and they don't understand why their age peers aren't interested. So, you know, the age peers may be reading chapter books or graphic novels, and here are kids who are reading Virgil's Aeneid in the original Latin and really don't understand why nobody wants to do the same.
Mark, Mr. Appel?
Yes.
I got a request for Armenian is translating. I have a request for Korean to start translating and for Spanish to start translating.
Okay, that you didn't want me to do that, did you?
No, thank you. You can
Okay.
continue to speak in English. I'm hoping this will be the last interruption, but my dear translators, go ahead and translate. No one can hear you but your parents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another thing is that we know with gifted and talented, they have what is called cognitive flypaper. And the thing about flypaper, for those who grew up with it, understand that everything sticks. The brain is really the bounty of organs. It's super absorbent. And what that results in is that our gifted and talented kids have access to a wonderfully large mental database of facts and ideas, and they will draw it seemingly out of nowhere. They can think abstractly, and you'll notice I say can and not do think abstractly, because they do tend to think in terms of black and white and tend to be very rigid. When you put it to them, they can, however. They have very mature and highly developed senses of humor, dry wit, satire, verbal over visual. And certainly the good thing about having this type of sense of humor is, as an educator, they get your jokes. But what it can also do is humor can be weaponized. So these are kids who can make friends through humor. They can come off as class clowns, but they know just where everybody's Achilles heel is. So it's important to watch for that. They enjoy spending time with older children, even younger adults. And that really has to do with cognitive age versus anything else. Now, I'm going to talk about attachments to a few friends and different conceptions and expectations of friendships. And what you'll see is that a lot of these characteristics almost feel as though they sort of border on obsessiveness and compulsion. And that has to do with the way that the gifted brain processes information. But one of the things that we really don't see a whole lot are sort of these herds of gifted kids roaming the plains. Usually we'll see them in, you know, dyads and triads. The only time that you will see that, however, happens here, well, usually is not going to happen this year, but that is down here in San Diego at Comic-Con. But usually what you will see is a very strong attachment to a few friends and almost obsessive, where you have, let's say you have two friends who come up to me as a teacher and go, oh, this is my best friend. We live next door to each other. We've been playing together ever since we were really little kids, and we really like your class, and we're going to go to the same middle school, but she's going to go to a different high school because she wants to, go to the private school down the road, but I'm going to stay here, and then we're going to go to the same college, and we're going to pledge the same sorority, and then we're going to, meet our spouses there, and then we're going to have a double wedding, and we're both going to major in pre-med, and then we're all going to go to medical school, and she's going to go to work in plastic surgery, but not the kind of plastic surgery to fix noses, but really to, do good work in the world. And I'm going to be a pediatrician, and then we're going to open up a practice together. And you're thinking, okay, you're only 8 years old and you have that all planned out. And what you will find is that when somebody new comes into the group, they're not exactly welcomed with open arms, because for people who seek outward approval and look inwardly for blame, what you're finding is that when somebody new comes in, one friend will say, but wait, I don't understand. I thought I was your best friend. We do all of these things together. What is wrong with me? What does this person have that I don't? And you will also see that overlap a little bit with perfectionism. You'll also see social pressures to moderate achievements in front of peers, because it's not always great to be the smartest kid in the class or the teacher's pet, especially when heading toward middle school. We're going to talk about perfectionism in greater detail in just a second. You'll see differences in individual versus group identity. They may seem different when they're with their friends than within their one-on-one with you. At times less interested in physical competition, but not always the case. You may see them question authority. They are prone to underachievement, and we'll look at why that might be. You may find boredom. They do enjoy complexity. They can be flexible thinkers. They're creative and original thinkers. They are can see relationships easily. One of the things that we try to do as educators is point out how different types of things are related. They see this naturally and organically. They enjoy hypotheses and what ifs, and you'll find that the same neurochemistry that drives everything that we love about gifted kids in the classroom, sort of these testing hypotheses, looking beyond, creativity and humor, can also wreak emotional havoc. So you can imagine that always asking what if can not necessarily always be a good thing. I worked with a family up in the Los Angeles area, not too far away from you all, where the family had a child who couldn't get to sleep, who would always stare at the ceiling. So after talking to the parents and asking, well, is the child getting enough exercise? Is it too much caffeine? Are they drinking Red Bulls? And it turns out, after a while, after talking to the kid, what the kid would do is review each of his days in great detail, and then do what is called a Gantt chart that looks at every conceivable possibility of different things happening to plot out an ideal day for the next. So this idea of what if, so what if I get up earlier, or what if I take a different route? How is that going to make me, how's that going to impact my day in a different way? They are keen on problem solving as well as aesthetics. So the idea of being attracted to the arts, which I think Mr. Partika articulated quite wonderfully, they engage in fantasy and role playing, because what they want to be able to do is extract themselves from what they believe is a mundane and boring life. So we might look at these kids and say, oh my gosh, you have such a great way about you. You're so smart, you're so creative. They don't see it like that. They see their lives as boring and mundane, and they want an exit from it. Hence the mention of Comic-Con earlier. When I was growing up, there were games in which you could do that, involving multiple dice and assuming different character identities. They have an innate intellectual curiosity and really understand how ideas come together. So we talked about seeing relationships easily. This means really, how do things relate, and how do they interweave? they're skeptical, critical, and evaluative. So for teachers, this is sort of the bane of our existence, because just because we have teaching credentials and the state says that we can teach doesn't mean that these kids are buying what we are selling. And, you know, if you make a mistake, they're quick to call you on it. And then related to relationships, you will see that they have a quick understanding of underlying principles, how things are built. Now, these next 3 pages, I'm not going to go through and read, but what they talk about is how socio-emotional characteristics are defined by different environmental conditions. So some of these characteristics manifest differently among culturally and linguistically diverse gifted students, among low socioeconomic and twice exceptional, which means that they are identified gifted, but also diagnosed as having a learning disability under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of federal law. So this is available when you access the presentation through SlideShare, but you will see that these characteristics are really contextually grounded. So let's move on to perfectionism. Usually I can look out into an audience, and you're an audience of 231, but all I see is really your names and a blank screen. But usually I can look out and I can tell who's a perfectionist just by the way you comport yourself. So let's talk about perfectionism. These are people who may think in terms of all or nothing, have strict rules about how they themselves or how others should act, and really not like feedback, not only negative feedback, but positive feedback as well. Feedback, period. These are people who perhaps believe that successes are flukes, determined primarily by luck, tend to beat themselves up about it. They define themselves by their accomplishments, which they rate with increasingly high standards, and people who tend not to have time for themselves. Now, if you are interested in this and think this might be you, I can guide you to a perfectionist quiz that you can take that examines strengths and challenges as related to perfectionism. I took the quiz and found out that I don't have any strengths whatsoever, which was alarming. Now, about perfectionism, and if you notice the title, you can count yourselves among them. Perfectionism is a personality disposition, not a disorder, but it's a disposition associated with striving for flawlessness and setting impossibly high standards. It is the perfectionist that sets these standards. So they're really never achievable, and the perfectionist really is her own worst enemy. And the way I can describe it, and there's a picture of it later, but imagine if you're running a race, and as you approach the finish line, and there is your family, and you're ready to break the ribbon, imagine if the finish line moves 500 feet every time you approach it. That's really what we're talking about. Now, you're not going to eliminate perfectionism. It is a disposition, but it can be channeled. And in moderate cases, it's positive. In extreme cases, destructive. And we can look at different types of perfectionists. Sometimes they overlap. So self-oriented perfectionists avoid personal failure at all costs. Other-oriented are judgmental and critical of others, saying that they can't achieve perfectionism because of everybody else, which is perhaps one of the reasons that gifted and talented kids don't like working in groups. And then there is socially prescribed. And this is sort of a combination and expansion of both of these two archetypes, that the world holds them up to such high standards, there's absolutely no hope that they could live up to them. Perfectionism has both positive and negative characteristics. Positive, they're reliable. These are the people that you want to pick you up at the airport. You say, my flight's going to arrive at 10. They're there at 8:30 in the cell phone parking lot with the door open. They are responsible. They're dedicated. They're driven. They are persistent. They will keep going. On the negative side, critical, unrealistic, approval speaking, prone to depression, and have a good degree of anxiety. And what we find is that there's a real paradox. So you can imagine, you think about it in terms of test anxiety. Now, when I graduated from college, I did not want to readily leave the loving arms of Mother University, so I took every test there was to get back into graduate school. I took the GRE, I took the GMAT, I took the LSAT, I took the MCAT, I took a vision test, I took a urine test, anything that would get me back into school. But I got so concerned about how well I would do, I did not do well at all. So what we find is anxiety over performance actually defeats performance because it undermines working memory. And that is because it triggers the survival response, and you really can't process information under the survival response. Remember, we were talking about noradrenaline and cortisol. And that's what we're talking about, and how flooding the brain with that undermines working memory. We know that perfectionists are influenced by parents' own perfectionist tendencies and separation anxiety in many cases. And we know that the perfectionist leads a stressful existence. They're incredibly self-critical. They tend to hide their mistakes, among many others. Things you're likely to see among perfectionists: depression, performance anxiety we talked about, test anxiety, social anxiety, writer's block, obsession, compulsiveness. Sometimes in the worst cases, you will see suicidal thoughts, loneliness, impatience, frustration, and anger. Now, I remember in graduate school, I always used to worry about the work that I was turning in. And it just never sat right with me. I just kept doing it and revising and revising and revising. And I had an advisor who said, look, the best project you could turn in is a done project. And we know that perfectionists tend to focus on outcomes, not necessarily processes. And never are really satisfied because they always know that there's more work to do. And I want to take you through the cycle of the perfectionist and explain how the neurochemistry works. So we know that gifted and talented tend to look outwardly for approval and inwardly for blame. And you can imagine that little kid there at the top coming home with a 97 on his test, and the teacher writing in the comments, you know, you're one of the best students who's come through this school in the last 5 years. So getting praise, you know, getting outward approval, which serves as a catalyst for feel-good chemistry, that neurochemistry that rewards us for performance and feeling love. Now, certainly that dissipates after a while, because what happens with a perfectionist is, you know, you look down at the paper and you go, wow, look at me, 97, that's pretty good. One of the best, you know, students who's come here in the last 5 years, you know, that's pretty great. Hey, you know, and my parents say, you know, that I'm a chip off the old block and that I'm going places. And then suddenly you notice the 97 and start thinking, wait a second, 97? I thought I studied hard for this. What did I miss? How could I miss 3? So you start looking for those things that you missed, and you find out you missed one question where the answer was E versus A. You start thinking, wait a second, I really studied that. Wait, what's wrong? Because I knew that, or I thought I knew that. What I need to do, and here we're moving on into exaggerated expectations, I got to do good, because a 97 is not going to get me into Harvard Medical School. You know, and being one of the best in the last 5 years, well, there's been a lot of kids who've come here in the last 5 years, and I've seen some of them, so being the best of them isn't that great. And, you know, what are my parents going to think? They're just saying that I did well, but really they're worried about me because I should have better than a 97. So you start looking and you start worrying, which activates the stress chemistry that we talked about, that the noradrenaline and the cortisol. And what you do is you wind up saying, okay, I'm going to fix this. I'm really going to put my nose to the grindstone. I am going to study all night, and I'm going to keep studying. So the next time you get a 98, and you start the same process over and over again. And iteratively, if you've ever experienced the survival mechanism, if you've ever had to, slam on the brakes in the middle of the freeway, you felt it. And you know that you feel drained, you might feel sick, you might feel nauseous, you might feel cold, and that's really your brain's way of telling you to avoid this situation. So imagine as a kid going through this again and again and again, to the point where we do what's called hitting the wall. Those of you who are runners know what that means. And if you're not a runner, there's a movie out there that you can rent called Run, Fat Boy Run, which is a wonderful movie. And it really describes hitting the wall quite well. So in terms of academics, what this means is if the teacher says, all you have to do is write your name on this test paper and you will get 110% and an A++, even that action is just too much. It's too overwhelming. That leads eventually to a cycle of underachievement, where when you do get the work, it's stellar, but that is becoming fewer and further between. So if you see the perfectionist scale there on the bottom, you will see how it works and how the goal moves. So it goes from good to very good to excellent, and the perfectionist has to go beyond excellent. And what that scale isn't doing, it usually works in 3 dimensions, and we're talking about perfectionism. Some people are perfectionists in terms of appearance or in terms of the way they live their lives. Some are academic and some are just general. So you can imagine being a perfectionist can be a hard life. Now, here is a quote from Hera Morano, as quoted in Psychology Today. She says, "To consign children to the pursuit of perfection is to trap them in an illusion. Like the anorexic literally dying to be thin, perfectionism consumes more and more of the self. Among the many paradoxes of perfectionism is yet one more. It is ultimately self-destructive to devote all one's psychic resources to oneself." So you can see how that emerges, where your pursuit of perfectionism ultimately defeats the pursuit of perfectionism because the goal line keeps moving. Now, I also want to share with you a related topic to perfectionism, which is imposter syndrome. And when we talk about imposter syndrome, we're not talking about imposters in the way that you might think of the talented Mr. Ripley, somebody who's impersonating someone. These are actually people, and among them Maya Angelou, who was a poet laureate and just an amazingly creative and wonderful person. These are people who think that they're pulling the wool over people's eyes. So these are people who experience success but feel as though that they are temporary, and any success that they experiences are likely to be flukes or odd coincidences. So, you've done well through your 12 years of school and wound up, getting into the University of California, and you'll ask somebody who's, living with imposter syndrome, and they'll say, well, I guess I was lucky, I guess I had the right teachers. There are a lot of people who helped me out. It's not really me. It's just, I caught a break. From the last few slides, the pursuit of perfection is damaging. Unfortunately, we live in an imperfect world, and that is a hard road to travel for a perfectionist. So let's take a look at what imposter syndrome is all about. Difficulty accepting praise, even when deserved. people who feel as though they are frauds who will be found out eventually, discounting or qualifying successes, just like we spoke of just a second ago, overworking, compulsion to be the best, somebody who's likely described as a perfectionist, people who become paralyzed by anxiety and avoid showing confidence. They have an interesting relationship with success. They desire it and dread it in equal parts, because even when you get it and that feel good chemistry is activated, you feel as though you don't deserve it. These are individuals who tend to compare struggles, and this is certainly exacerbated by social media platforms like Instagram. It's related to this idea of fear of missing out, that everyone seems to be getting by just great and having a great life and getting by with a lot less difficulty. These are people who believe that success lies in charm and not abilities. Oh, I'm a nice guy. I can really pull it off. I can really, I can sell it well. These are people who focus on what they have done, not what they have, and always convinced that they're just not enough, which makes them somewhat risk averse. And the further away they get from it, the further the symptoms increase. So here's some things to think about for those perfectionists or aspiring perfectionists. Perfection and excellence are not one and the same. And the path to excellence is meandering and messy. It's not straight. A lot of gifted and talented individuals want a straight line to their destination, and they want to enjoy satisfaction and perfection on every point of the way there. But those of us who have wound up in jobs or careers that we love know that it really wasn't, for the most part, a straight line. We kind of stumbled into some things, and we wound up where we were meant to be. For our perfectionists, you've got to realize that you have to suffer through 25 drafts or bombs to get one good artifact, and learn to appreciate the journey more so than the end product. And we know that perfectionists tend to live in the past and they tend to live in the future, but really never in the present. And it's not good enough to be perfect at the end. So let's say, you have a project and at the end you get 100% and an A+. But unless every point along the way, every check-in was perfect, it doesn't count. The end result doesn't count because everything along the way has to be perfect. And there's some wisdom from Winston Churchill, who said, the maxim, nothing but perfection, may be spelled Parallysis. And you will find that independent projects for a lot of our gifted and talented tend to be difficult because they're great with ideas, but when it comes to the actual doing, they get paralyzed because the task seems overwhelming if they can't do it perfectly. So a little bit about working with the perfectionists. Learn to embrace mistakes and celebrate failure. I think our schools are coming around to that. Explain the shortcomings of an all or nothing perspective. What do you lose from that?
Mr.
Emphasize.
Appel,
Yes.
just, do you see on your screen some slides?
Creative artwork? Yes, I do.
Okay.
It looks like somebody's drawing in crayon. So
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So we were getting some comments about it, and I wondered if you had any control over that.
I barely have control over my own speech, much less the crayons, but my SlideShare doesn't have that on it. So when you download it, it will be absent the lines.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Rest assured, audience.
Okay, second bullet, okay.
Okay, second bullet, third bullet actually. When we're talking as either teachers or parents, promoting learning versus evaluation, and really having an explicit conversation about how perfectionism can be counterproductive. And you might say, well, I thought you said, that feedback is dangerous and that sort of thing. One of the things that we know about most gifted and talented individuals is that they are equal parts rational and equal parts emotional. So if the problem is emotional, appeal to the rational, and they will be able to perhaps understand it a little bit better. And to make it even more so, what you want to do is not focus it upon the child themselves, but maybe talk about your own perfectionism and let them solve your problem. That's what we're talking about when we talk about epiphany-based solutions. Understand where your kids are coming from. Don't just tell them to loosen up. That's not going to do the job. They've got to understand that everyone makes mistakes, not just mom and dad, but the people that they admire. They, you know, if they're great admirers of Einstein or of Sally Ride or of Matisse, everyone's made mistakes and they've come out okay on the other side. What we're trying to do, somebody must not like my presentation. They're scribbling it out. The idea here is not to eliminate perfectionism, but to channel it and to guide it in a positive direction. Help them with setting priorities and really give into empathy and self-awareness. And let's talk about praising and critiquing. So when we're talking about praise, we're talking about rewarding process and effort, not always the result, and praising with specificity. If you tell a kid, you are the best writer I have seen, what that does, it doesn't create a ceiling. What it does, it creates a floor. So initially, they're going to say, oh my gosh, the best writer you've ever seen. Oh, that's fantastic. And then they're going to think, well, this paper, I really tried hard. Now what am I going to do? Because now I'm going to be expected to be a great writer in perpetuity. So that's great. Now I'm even more stressed about it. So what we try to do is praise specific things. So for example, talking about the best writer, you can say, hey, I love the way that you connected this character with this other character. You did a great job of articulating this person's inner monologue versus you're brilliant. You're the most brilliant person I know. You want to build out intrinsic rewards, the value of doing things for their own sake. You will have perfectionists who are incredibly hard on themselves. They'll say, you know, they'll miss one problem of their AP calculus assignment and they will just start beating themselves up. And they'll say, I am horrible at math. I'm never going to become anything. I'm not going to get admitted to college and I'm not going to be able to do any more math and the teacher's going to hate me and it's just going to sort of balloon. So what you can do, again, is appeal to the rational side. Say, okay, yeah, you're probably, you know, the worst mathematician who ever lived. But, you know, tell me a little bit about how you know that. And as the child is sort of going through, they'll come to realize just sort of how ridiculous it sounds. So if you ask for supporting evidence, either that or they won't be able to give it to you. And if they say, you know, I won't be able to do this, I'm not good enough, say, okay, well, what do you need to be able to do it? Think of it almost as a work-related problem. What might be done next time to improve results? Okay, so you didn't do as well on your 4th grade mission projects as you hoped. What are you going to do next time? And help them really understand the nature of mistakes and failure as information, not a fixed outcome. So if you don't do well, you're not branded with the scarlet C. It's just a way of saying, okay, here's what I need to move ahead. So working with perfectionism and understanding socio-emotional characteristics and stress is incredibly important in the current environment because right now we are working a lot differently. And the sudden shift from what was routine, the sense of stability and predictability, has now been sort of torn away. And what we're trying to do is mitigate the impacts of ambiguity and work within a new context of remote learning. we've been doing remote learning at least since I was in college, and when my lecture halls would fill up, a lot of us would get shunted into a smaller room where the professor was on TV. It's something that you can see here. This is actually from a high school in the 1950s. So there is a history behind it, and we've been trying to get it right for a while. And we know that a lot of gifted and talented are on the net anyway, playing different games or accessing different resources. But interacting socially is a lot different. So we're going to have to figure out what are some of the challenges. Now, I work with teachers across the nation, and we are trying to support their teaching practice remotely. And we're asking them, well, are you having trouble teaching equations? Are you having trouble teaching literature? And they're saying, we're just having trouble reducing the kids' anxiety. We're having trouble providing a sense of routine and stability. And again, as you can see from this picture, and it's not too far off, this was a picture from the mid-1950s about what they thought the 2000s would be like in terms of the way that kids learn. And as you can see, you sort of have laptops, you sort of have individualized instruction, you have a teacher who's looking over, you see flying cars, which never came to pass. But we are lucky that these machines that used to take up whole rooms and were sort of the exclusive purview of NASA are available to us. But what we know is when we talk about quality remote learning, we should be able to just take the word remote out, because we are talking about quality learning. First thing that we need to do, both as educators and as parents, is appreciate the shock to the system and know that, yes, things are different, and we want to be able to provide a sense of peace of mind. So what you want to be able to do is help find footing, help establish structure, help establish routine. Remember, attending to the social emotional first. Find a sense of stability. Go for enrichment before accelerating. Have them reacclimatize to the new sense of normal and let them know that this will be okay. We want to be able to move the brain out of survival mode. And you as parents should realize that some of the characteristics that you've seen may be intensified because of this shift. Now, working from home, so anybody who is suffering from Zoom fatigue, and I think many of us are, because a lot of us are working from home. I know that when I look at my wife and I look at my dog, they're all in boxes and they have their names on, and I think I can press mute. But working from home, even for kids, is still work. So encouraging brain breaks and time away from screen is important. Staying organized and staying focused. The great thing about remote learning is it offers an opportunity to build out metacognitive skills. And what I mean by that are skills associated with being organized, with being creative, finding new ways to communicate, finding new ways to collaborate. Those essential metacognitive skills are not only important to thriving in elementary, middle, and high school, but they're essential at the university, and they are essential for work. And when we talk to our industry partners, they say that's what we need most. Staying in touch with friends, keeping socialization. So we have at UC San Diego the Sally Ride Science Junior Academy, and we usually have about 900 kids running through a building during summer doing science activities. All of that is going remote now. And one of the things that we said is we need to retain socialization and community building, because we know that one of the best facets of the Academy is the opportunity to keep in touch with other kids and with peers. Staying in touch with teachers is essential. Make sure you understand expectations, not only for students, but for parents. Not only online, but for offline. Emphasize clarity. Emphasize sort of mitigating the impacts of ambiguity and realizing that not everything will be perfect. Anybody who's been on a Zoom meeting where your internet has gone down or your dog starts to bark or the doorbell rings knows that real life tends to interfere. So we're all trying to renegotiate this new world, but it's a great lesson in building out resilience and celebrating failure and minding bandwidth. So, certainly you could look at the scribbles on the screen and go, oh my gosh, that's terrible. I can't believe I'm spending an afternoon watching this. And I could say, well, gosh, this was a really awful presentation. I'm never going to be able to do this again. But I can say, hey, that's the kind of thing that happens. So it's a good lesson for kids. And just remember that remote learning need not be the exclusive domain at the school. Sure, it's great to be able to learn from teachers, but there are also a host of other resources, a lot of which I've provided for you on my SlideShare. But I will again refer you to the STEAM channel at UCTV, where we're working with local museums and local scientists to provide opportunities for engagement and activities in the home. Even for PE, it's a great way to find balance, and it's a great way to sort of return a sense of normalcy, not only to our gifted and talented kids, but to the family unit as a whole. So, comments and questions. Hopefully you've been able to see the association between these social-emotional characteristics and how emotion impacts learning and how that all factors in to remote delivery. Now, I think I see in the chat that there's 99 questions. I'm not going to try. So Kelly, I will ask you please to hand me the first.
Okay, will you take off your screen share?
I will if I can find it. There we go. Wow, hello everybody.
We have one parent that asked the question, it must have been the creativity part where
Yes.
they think in black and white and are also creative thinkers. Can you explain how it is that they do both?
Sure. So, when we talk about thinking in black and white, it's not universal. So there are some things that they understand to be black and white, rules and regulations and laws and ways of being. But in different pursuits, let's say artistic pursuits or literature or speaking, they tend to be creative because the rules are a little bit less defined. So it is possible to be both. But the real challenge in working with our gifted and talented kids, again, just like the challenge in working with anybody else, including ourselves, is finding a sense of balance, finding a sense of harmony, and really understanding that things are always in a state of flux. Nothing is permanent. So I would say, you can be both, and you should be both. Keep a careful eye to make sure that you afford opportunities not only to see black and white, but also shades of gray.
Well, I don't see any more questions, Mr. Appel, but I got a lot of compliments on your presentation. We're so grateful that you came.
Well, thank you so very much. I really do appreciate it. I know that there are 200 of you here, and I really am grateful that you spent a little over an hour with me. I am at your disposal. Please do go to my SlideShare. I'm not even going to try and write it in the chat because it will get lost. I am going to give you my email address, which is M as in Morgan.
Hold on, I'll put it right here.
Okay.
Hang on with me, and let me write this down. Stay on with me for a few minutes after, and I'll show you where those online resources are. So, Mr. Appel, you are stay on with me.
Okay, I'm
let's
here.
Do it right now here. M. Appel at
ucsd.edu. And you'll also find that information on the last page of my presentation. I would suggest emailing. I'm not. It's not as easy to get to my office telephone, but if you email me, I promise you, I will answer whatever question you have and direct you to whatever resources you may need.
There is one more question here, which is
Of
very
course.
interesting. How do you keep them away from excessive screen time and gaming while doing online learning?
Well, here's an interesting thing. Not let's see, I would say maybe about a year ago, I actually did a study on the impacts of social media and internet addiction on the gifted and talented. So just to let you know that that presentation is also on my slide share, that you can access it. But again, it is really finding a careful balance. And now that's made a little bit more difficult because usually what you're able to do is, say, hey, put this down and, go outside and go find some stimulation outside. But now it's a lot harder to do that. I think it's really finding a sense of balance, and maybe it's not so much avoiding screen time period, but maybe using screen time in a different way. So using screen time as a way to keep contact with friends and with family, but the in-person time is now so far and so far between. I think it is actually a something of a novelty now. I think kids, I have a niece and a nephew, and they were always on screen. They were playing Fortnite and a game that I really don't understand. It apparently involves a lot of dancing and killing people, but they are telling me that they want to go back to school. They miss school. They miss the social interaction. So I don't think finding time away from screen will be difficult. It's just the way in which you use it.
Okay, so I think that's it for now. We're going to make available the recording. We're going to make available your slide deck. I think some people already found it.
Mm-hmm.
We're so grateful for our translators, for Doug Lang from Education Technology Services. My director is here, Dr. Lena Richter. Thank you for coming. And parents, you stayed for the whole thing. Thank you so much, and lots of compliments. They learned a lot. So you know where we are. Just email us. I'll put my email down too. And before we say goodbye to you, Mr. Appel, I want to ask the parents that need to see where they can find some online resources. If they just stay with me, I'll do that for the next 10 minutes. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I did see a question go by about high schoolers in the age of C19. Again, I want to direct you to UCTV. We actually have college counselors who are addressing that issue specifically. What you'll see there is sort of a 15-minute video that you can just download and watch. There's a lot of great resources there that should answer a lot of your pandemic-related questions.
Do you feel like this slide deck is good to go over with students?
Do I? Me? Yeah. I do. I think, I think a lot of us are sort of anxious about sharing stuff like this with kids, but the best way to learn is to be explicit about these types of things. They may be suffering from perfectionist tendencies and feel as though that there's something wrong with them. So providing this information is critical so they realize they are not alone in this. So I think it is absolutely fine. And certainly if there are parents out there who would like to share it with their students and want some advice on how it might be used, let me know. I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much. Well, you don't have to drive back to San Diego tonight, but you need to get back to your life as well. So we'll see you in the new year, and I'll make sure that everybody gets everything they need to reach out to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, parents and district staff. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Good night.